Welcome. My name is Tiffany Kreiner, and I am serving this year as the faculty coordinator of the Core Book program. I'm going to be emceeing this event tonight. Tonight's session is an interdisciplinary panel designed to help all interested members of our community to engage fruitfully and powerfully with this year's core book, Sandra Benitez's The Weight of All Things. The Core Book program is designed to be a gift to all the communities that touch Wheaton, from the very distant to the very local. Core Book, through study guides, curricular supports, chapel messages, experiential learning, and interdisciplinary events, seeks to create stronger ties within Wheaton communities and to give us shared language for asking and answering questions at the core of human experience and at the heart of our Christ at the Core curriculum. The Weight of All Things is a powerful story of the suffering and displacement of Salvadoran people during the Salvadoran Civil War. The novel homes in on the experiences of a 9-year-old boy, Nicolas, and his story is framed by two traumatic historical events which leave him orphaned and homeless. The mass shooting at the funeral of Archbishop Oscar Romero on March 30th, 1980, and the Sumpo River massacre on May 14th of that same year. Through the story of a boy and his grandfather caught in the middle of a civil war that was itself a proxy battleground for the Cold War, we are enabled to ask questions about the collateral damage associated with political conflict. Our Christ at the Core curriculum and its first-year seminar asks about the good life and how we might know and live it. And this book helps us ask the questions of what our conceptions and pursuits of the good life have to do with the sufferings and experiences of other people near and far. What is a neighbor's responsibility to community members displaced by violence and under constant threat? Our panel tonight involves 4 speakers from different disciplines in a kind of public book group meeting. Our experts are from literary studies, anthropology, theology, and music composition. And each member of the panel will speak a little bit, just a brief piece, about how their own disciplinary and contextual knowledge will help us to read the novel differently and better than we may have otherwise. After this, with whatever time remains, I will facilitate a little discussion among our panelists in which their contextual information may mix and mingle as they seek together to cultivate meaning from the novel, to bear together the weight of all things, and to place it even more powerfully in the good soil of our hearts and lives. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'll just sort of pass the mic around. Our first speaker tonight is Carlos Colón, who is a composer and liturgist and cultural promoter. He comes to us from Baylor University, where he specializes in making music that is academically serious and ecclesiastically valuable. He was born in Chalchuapa, El Salvador, but at a young age during the Civil War that our novel depicts, he was forced to leave El Salvador and took refuge in Guatemala City. His music has been performed at festivals, conferences, and churches throughout the world, and his personal experience of the Salvadoran Civil War informs his composition's calls to justice and peace and beauty. For example, his Las Lamentaciones de Rufina Amaya is a requiem in memory of the victims of El Mozote, where the Salvadorian army massacred 800 peasants in 1981. His Obertura para un Mártir commemorates the martyr Archbishop Oscar Romero, whose funeral figures so largely in the opening of our novel. That piece was commissioned by the President and First Lady of El Salvador and was premiered there in 2010. We're excited to welcome him not only as an acclaimed composer, but also as a Wheaton parent of 2 first-year students. We also have another Colón here tonight, though these two have actually only been recently introduced to one another and are not related. Christine Colón is professor of English here at Wheaton, where she teaches Latin American literature and Victorian literature. Her research surrounds 19th century literature foremost, and she's published widely on authors including Jane Austen, Dorothy L. Sayers, and Joanna Bailey. Our third panelist, Gerardo Corpeño, hails also from El Salvador originally, but now serves on the theology faculty at El Seminario Teológico Centroamericano, CETECA, in Guatemala City, an institution where several other members of our BITH department have also served, including Danny Carroll and Carlos Sosa, making the BITH department here something of a CETECA satellite, certainly a sister campus. He is currently completing his doctoral work here in theology, and his research considers the relation between liberation and reconciliation in Latin American Christology. Our fourth panelist, James Huff, is Associate Professor of Hunger and Anthropology and Associate Director of the Human Needs and Global Resources Program here. His scholarly interests focus on international and rural community development, religion in Latin America, faith-rooted social movements and NGOs, and comprehensive community initiatives. For the past decade, he has regularly conducted ethnographic fieldwork in El Salvador, where he has documented the involvement of Pentecostal churches in community-based development projects. I'm especially glad to have Dr. Huff on the panel tonight because it was his recommendation that led to The Weight of All Things being chosen as this year's core book. And his tireless efforts have led to the helpful reading guide and discussion materials that are available for the clicking on our core book website. So if you will, join me in welcoming our panelists for tonight.
Good evening. Gabriel Garcia Marquez remarked upon receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1982 that magical realism has thrived in Latin America because if we told you our true story, you would not believe us. I grew up in a little town in El Salvador where mystery and magic seemed to meet you at every corner. Mayan ruins and temples were our playgrounds after school. These are the ruins of El Tazumal. My town is called, that's a block from my house, by the way. I thought that was normal growing up, you know. Everybody has their own Mayan ruins to go and climb. And the name Chalchuapa means river of jade. Even today, you can still dig almost anywhere and find jade stones. As a kid, I thought that I had bad luck. When I would dig out, I will find mostly pieces of pre-Columbian pottery and heads of gods instead of these mysterious green stones. And so far, many of us from El Salvador have lived to tell the tale of our country. And we survive by telling stories, by eating and drinking together, and dancing to happy songs and minor keys. There have been times when my life was in danger, and I was protected by community and angels. Like the rest of humanity, our joys and our laments have wings, just like the beautiful, colorful birds that adorn our continent. Here is another view of Chalchuapa, my village. The church at the foreground is 400 years old. And I like to say that's where I was baptized the first time. One of these birds that adorn our country is this beautiful bird with a beautiful song, and it's called the Dichoso Fui. And since I am a musician, I have permission, I guess, to imitate the song, you know. is what it does. And the name means literally something to, I once was blessed. Gerardo can correct me here and check me here. When I would go to the hills around my village, the peasants would remind us not to shoot with our slingshots these birds, because they're the penitent souls of people who have not found peace in the afterlife. And their song is a queja, a lament. Our beloved national poet, Alfredo Espino, a man who died at age 28 for love of a girl, wrote a poem about the Dichoso Fui bird. I set this poem and other poems of Espino to music a few years ago. And when it was premiered in El Salvador, it was with a select youth orchestra from Central America. The guest conductor, a maestro from Spain, was scolding the orchestra players for not embodying the music with feeling. To make a point, he started reading Espino's poetry. As he read, the young players joined him and all started reciting the poem from memory with him. He was deeply moved. And I want to tell you that yes, we come from a country that still memorizes poetry and reveres poets. Now, as you getting into the story of the book, as you know, from 1978 to 1993, we had a civil war that lasted more than 12 years and killed 75,000, or an average of 17 people a day, in a place with the size of the population of Massachusetts. But this type of violence was not new to us. We have in our history an infamous general that came to power in 1931. His name was General Martinez. And he came to power, like many in Latin America in the 20th century, through a military coup. He would reign with an iron fist for 13 years. In 1932, he suppressed a rebellion by killing 30,000 indigenous natives whom he accused of being communist. As a result, our indigenous population became afraid of wearing their traditional clothing and would not even speak their native tongue in public. One of my best friends in El Salvador is learning his language now and teaching it to school children. He says that there are only 6 citizens left in the whole country for whom this dialect is their native tongue. I think I have a picture of my friend Neftali. He's actually a music teacher and also teaches languages. As a young boy, I witnessed my country inflamed in a civil war. Right-wing death squads conducted kidnappings and executions. A reign of terror became the norm. One day, 10 decapitated bodies were lined up, one per block, in our street. As the reign of terror continued, many of my mother's best friends were arrested or killed. We knew it was time to leave. My mother sent me ahead to Guatemala City a few weeks before they left. Mere hours before their departure, or mere hours after their departure, a death squad broke into their home, but my family had managed to escape. And there are many ways in which I identify with Nicolás Veras, the main character in the book, including our childhood nickname, Chele. We both experienced the Salvadorian War in similar ways, and we both were displaced and forced to leave our communities. And we were both caught in the middle of the right-wing military and the left-wing communist guerrillas. But there are also complicated variations and shades in our stories and the ways that we were caught. For example, we both had loved ones on both sides of the conflict. Music and culture are some of the sub-themes I see in the book. I grew up influenced by the liberation theology music of the Catholic Church and some Protestant groups that had embraced it, which was played on the Catholic radio, so on the guerrillas radio called Venceremos. In the midst of the conflict, liberation theology seemed to some to be the answer. But to those of us who were looking for transformational mystery, it was a water that did not satisfy. It is said that in Latin America, when the established church opted for the poor opted for the evangelicals and the Pentecostals. One of these songs that I imagine that Nicolás and the guerrillas that were occupying his farm were singing and dancing to, it's a song that I learned to love, and I would sing and sing, and I never, until I started thinking of the lyrics. It's called El Cristo de Palacagüina. And the song goes like this, you know, tonight Christ is born in Palacagüina, son of Joseph, son of Mary. And, and it all seems kind of seductively incarnational, but at the end, the very last verse says, Joseph dreams that the boy will be a carpenter like him, but the boy says, I am going to be a guerrilla fighter, And so this I have been coming to terms in recent years in my music in the ways that I care for justice and for those who fought for it. But I also have realized that the Christ of Bethlehem is more dangerous than the Marxist one, as he demands my all in all and calls me to death and transformational holiness. Today, I live mostly in the US, and I feel again caught between left and right wings, and things are turning violent. I believe deeply that a failure of the church in El Salvador during the war was a failure of the Christian imagination, and that's a lesson for us. Evangelicals here in this country need to be re-evangelized by the scriptures and the testimony of the early church, because our faith is historical, so that we can become a church that brings change through transformed congregations and individuals. I hope to unpack some of the violence I see, and I don't want to be a prophet of doom, but that seems to keep growing in our country when I come back, God willing, in March. Thank you.
I would like to begin my reflections where Sandra Benitez begins her novel. Not with the tragic details of Nicolas's story, nor even with the historical note that she uses to orient us to the time and place of his story, but rather with her epigraph, the quotation from which she drew the title of the novel. This quotation, "Life is heavier than the weight of all things," comes from a poem entitled "The Neighbor" by Rainer Maria Rilke. And I would like to read to you the final stanza from a translation by Albert Ernest Fleming. Why is it that I am always neighbor to those lost ones who are forced to sing and to say, life is infinitely heavier than the heaviness of all things? For me, much of the beauty of The Weight of All Things comes from the various ways that Benitez helps us to see the lives of those lost ones, asking us to identify with our neighbors in their distress, but also repeatedly reminding us that, for most of us, their world is not our world, and our understanding of them will always be incomplete. This is a challenging task in today's literary world, where we tend to judge a novel simply by how much we relate to it. We like to identify with the characters, but by doing so, we often run the risk of oversimplifying their stories, of ignoring the parts that we can't relate to, in order to make our neighbor, the one we should be learning about, more like us. What struck me most about The Weight of All Things is the way that Benitez manages this challenge, drawing us into the lives of Nicolas and his grandfather, but never allowing us to forget that we cannot reduce their story to one that fits better with our own experiences. Let me highlight a few examples of this. On the surface, The Weight of All Things can read like a simple coming-of-age story, as tragedy compels young Nicholas to grow up and choose who he's going to be in response to the warfare around him. The final scene of the novel, sorry, spoiler for anybody who hasn't read it, the final scene of the novel, where Nicholas embraces both the might of a lion and the heart of a lamb, and the epilogue that reveals his future career as a doctor, can lull us into thinking that this is a story simply about that development. But throughout the novel, Benitez reminds us that there is a much wider, more complicated story that we need to be paying attention to. Let's start with the character of Nicolas. Early in the novel, when Nicolas asks the man carrying his mother away from the barricade, "Where are you taking her?" the narrator tells us that he was trying to keep fright from his voice, and then comments, "He was 9 after all, and a man." As readers, we might be tempted to smile at the thought of a 9-year-old thinking of himself as a man. But as the novel continues, we learn that Nicholas is not the innocent 9-year-old that we might expect to find at the beginning of a coming-of-age novel. Even before the death of his mother, Nicholas has already experienced too much of the adult world. He knows, for instance, that he needs to find an old woman to sit next to on the bus, because young people, specifically young men, provided dangerous company. Too frequently, they were dragged from buses, from eating places, even from the sanctity of their own dwellings by the soldiers. His fears are shown to be justified when the soldiers stop the bus and order a young man out of his seat. And when that happens, Nicholas knows the routine. This young man, like so many others, will simply disappear. This is Nicholas's world, and he knows it well, and not simply by observing the experiences of others, for we soon discover that he has survived an attack on his school that killed his teacher and his friends. Yes, he is 9 years old, but this is not a simple coming-of-age story, and Benitez repeatedly reminds us of that as she reveals what this 9-year-old has already experienced. Benitez also reminds us of the differences of Nicholas's world by the way that she uses Spanish throughout the novel. Benitez uses Spanish sparingly, and readers who don't know the language will probably be grateful for the fact that she generally helps us out with clear translations, as she does when Nicholas sees the words above the door in the pantry that will eventually be his escape from the garrison. The narrator tells us that the words "enter here" appear above the door, but as Nicholas sounds out the words, they are actually "entre aquí." While Benitez translates the words for her readers, she repeatedly reminds us that Nicholas's thoughts and words are all in Spanish. In addition to this, Benitez occasionally chooses not to provide a translation, or even to fully explain some words, leaving her readers to try and figure it out by context, guessing at what they cannot completely understand. One interesting example of this is the Hosta Tree that stood near the church in Nicholas's town and was split in half by the bombing. Now, for most of us, that word does not immediately resonate with a picture in our minds. We aren't familiar with that kind of tree, and other than telling us that it has a massive trunk and its heart is a tender pale yellow, Benitez doesn't give us much else. With a little research, however, and a quick email to Carlos, we can discover a few things. And we can discover that there might be a reason why Benitez is using this particular tree at this moment in the novel. The Hosta tree, which is found throughout El Salvador, is not only large and strong, but it also has seed pods that are shaped like ears. Traditionally, this tree has been represented as a place of refuge, a place where people can safely share their secrets. With this context, we can understand more clearly how the destruction of this tree, which for all of Nicholas's life had shaded the church, is a powerful symbol of the dangerous ramifications of this war that is rapidly destroying the safety of the people caught in the middle. But this is a symbol that means far more for Nicholas and those familiar with the world of El Salvador than for most readers of the novel. It is a symbol that the rest of us can only partially understand. Throughout the novel, Benitez reminds us of the gap that exists between our world and our neighbors. And I want to conclude with one more way that she does this. Her decision to repeatedly shift between names and common nouns or pronouns when she presents her characters. You may not have noticed, but Benitez begins her novel without naming her characters. We are introduced to Nicholas as the boy, and his mother is introduced as her and she. We don't learn Nicholas's name until the bottom of page 2, when his mother comforts him in the midst of the chaos by saying, "I am here, Nicholas." And we don't learn his mother's name until page 7. While we gradually come to know Nicholas and his story, at first he and his mother could simply be two nameless victims of the violence. And Benitez draws our attention back to this at different points throughout the novel, as she shifts between the names that she has given to her characters and more general descriptors that cause us to see them at a distance. When Nicholas disappears, for instance, his beloved Tata is described repeatedly as the old man, becoming, in fact, a representative of all of the old men of El Salvador who are longing to be reunited with the loved ones that they fear have disappeared forever. This idea of Nicholas and Tata being only representatives of a much larger, much more complicated story becomes even clearer at the end of the novel, when Benitez takes the time to name the various people that they are traveling with as they try to escape to Honduras. We are introduced to Luz, with an infant strapped to her back, bouncing lightly on her feet to produce a gentle jostle that lulled the baby to sleep. To 5-year-old Moises, whose job was to shush the dog if it started to bark. And to Adela Orellana and her mother, Doña Carmelina, who both wore their aprons as if at any moment they would be called upon to cook. But each of these characters soon disappears amidst the chaos of the massacre at the Sumpur River, becoming some of the nameless victims whose stories are lost in the tragedy. With her novel, Sandra Benitez asks us to learn about a neighbor, one of the lost ones who must sing about the weight of all things. But she doesn't want us to forget that he is only one of many, and all of them have their complex stories that we can never completely understand.
First of all, thank you for being here, and I'm glad that I'm not going to be the only one to make spoilers, so prepare for another. This is my reading of the novel. This is a novel about childhood. It is also about the endearing relationship between a son and his mother. It is a novel about love and care. However, all of these things have been drastically interrupted by an abnormal situation that has nothing to do either with childhood or with love, a war. For this reason, this is also a novel about loss and the profound and unspeakable pain that this loss causes. It is the loss precisely of that sacred bond between a mother and his son. This loss is not natural, but unnatural, because it is the result of injustice, hate, and violence. And yet, at the end of the day, I think this novel is above all about hope and peace. To be sure, the hope comes almost like a small whisper. It comes through Nicholas, who not only has survived the crossfire of bullets between the guerrilla and the army, but more importantly, he has survived to the spiral of violence, hate, and retribution. He has gained the bravery of a lion, but maintaining the purity of the lamb in his heart. In this regard, I would like to say that I disagree a little bit with the title of the book. So I would like to suggest an alternative title, The Roar of the Lamb. I suspect that the author will not be in total disagreement with me on this. Indeed, she contemplated this title as one of the possibilities before she decided for the actual title of the book, as she recognized in an interview. As Benitez said in this interview, this title makes perfect sense once you read the whole book. Especially through its outcome, the novel raises a dialectic between taken or not taken up arms, between entering the cycle of violence and refusing to do so. And it does it through its central character, Nicholas. Nicholas, who is also the innocent voice in the narrative, which tells the story caught in between crossfire of weapons and ideologies. The author already has provided us through the novel some clues that point to this dialectic between violence and non-violence. For instance, when the narrator tells us that Nicholas, and I quote, does not want to be a soldier, but to save lives. Or when Dr. Alvarado asks how he has heard and by whom, and Nicholas, who was a victim of crossfire, simply replies, quote, it was either the army or the guerrillas. In the end, they're all the same, end of quote. Or when exhausted and almost unconscious as they passed through the Sumpur River, Nicholas, and I quote, let the river take him to a place where there were no guns, no soldiers, no guerrillas, end of quote. But without doubt, it is the climatic scene at the end of the story that highlights and confirms how this dialectic between violence and not violence will unfold. Nicholas faces the dilemma of taking an M16 rifle. At that tense moment, Tata asks, what are we going to do with that? Nicholas pulled the weapon from Basilius' hands and said, I know what to do. The rest is history. If you want that history, you have to read the book. It's at the very end of the book. The tension between violence or non-violence is finally resolved. Hope arises, but not through any of the adult voices, much less through the army or the guerrillas, but through a child. The one who decided to walk with the courage of a lion and the heart of a lamb. Because it is precisely under the circumstances of a war where it takes more courage to leave a weapon than to take it.
Thank you again for inviting me to participate in this. This is really a special moment for me personally and professionally, so I'm really grateful for this opportunity. So I've titled my comments tonight, On Structural Violence in the Weight of All Things. Let me begin my comments with a quote from a lecture that Dr. Paul Farmer, who is an anthropologist like me and a medical doctor not like me, he gave a lecture at Johns Hopkins University in 2001. The lecture was entitled An Anthropology of Structural Violence. I quote Farmer here because his accounting of the lasting and adverse effects of structural violence in Haiti are very germane to the handful of points that I want to make tonight about the weight of all things. Farmer explains that, quote, structural violence is violence exerted systematically, that is, indirectly, by everyone who belongs to a certain social order, end quote. It is a concept, structural violence, that informs how anthropologists like myself study what he calls, quote, the social machinery of oppression, end quote. Structural violence is not the sort of violence that is exerted directly, although it very often makes possible such expressions. It is usually not visible to the naked eye. It is a kind of violence that is rooted in processes. Structural violence prefers the language of collateral damage because it is built into systems that generate violence that no one is responsible for. As the sociologist Cecilia Menjivar puts it, such violence is often the, quote, byproduct of our social and economic structure, and it is invisible, and it is hard to care about, end quote. To be sure, the story we have all read, some of us, is uncomfortably full of examples of direct violence, moments when individuals in the story suffer immense and terrible harm at the hands of other individuals. Recall the scene, as Dr. Colón mentioned earlier in Chapter 4, when Nicholas is boarding the bus 38 to Chalatenango. There we start to catch a glimpse of structural violence that shaped the life chances of many young Salvadoran men at the time. But it is mostly a description of the direct violence that boys and young men encountered often during the war. As the narrator notes, quote, young people, specifically young men, provided dangerous company. And Dr. Colón has already mentioned what happens at the end of the chapter. What I find disturbingly compelling about this story is how it asks me to inquire about the invisible processes and historical factors that make such episodes of direct violence so commonplace in the decades before, during, and after the Salvadoran Civil War. The story, in other words, prompts me to wonder about the larger forces of violence that are at work behind the visible expressions that we see. The burdensome weight that I feel when I read this story is not simply prompted by witnessing and imagining repeated episodes of direct violence. Rather, for me, it is something that is slow. It's more like a dreadful, uncomfortable awakening. It happened to me as I proceeded through the story. It happened to me in the moments when I would catch glimpses of structural violence that made possible physical and corporeal instances of it. In my opinion, the terrible weight of this story also refers to the social order of things in Salvadoran life in the past and in the present. There is another scene later in the story where we catch a glimpse of structural violence. It too involves an encounter with the Salvadoran military. It's in chapter 23, when Nicholas, I'm going to turn and find it, is being interrogated by Capitan Portillo, or as we would say in El Salvador, Portillo, not Portillo. This is not Uruguay. I want to read a quote from you on page 144. Let me tell you something else, Nicholas, about the Army, Captain Portillo says. The Army won't tolerate subversives and informers and anarchists. It won't tolerate malcontents with militant ideas. Listen. It won't tolerate idealists and dreamers and reformers whose mission it is to change the world. The Army is sure and swift when it comes to rabble-rousers. I'll spare you the gruesome details, Nicolas de la Virgen Veras. Pay close attention to what I tell you. We are giving you this chance to improve your sorry life. We catch you talking with anyone suspicious, we catch you scheming or trying to get away, the whole of the National Army will fall on you like buzzards on rotting meat. The scene won't be pretty. It won't be pretty for you or for anyone we catch you consorting with. Do I make myself clear? Do you understand what I'm saying? Sí, Capitán. What does this allude to? Nicholas's life as a campesino, as someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time very often in the story, is a sorry one. A pathetic life, in the words of Captain Portillo, that, quote, needs to be turned around. I think this scene makes partially visible the structural violence that sorry people like Nicholas and other Salvadoran smallholder farmers and members of rural households had endured for centuries in El Salvador. These were the effects of unequal land distribution and highly exploitative land tenure systems, systems that one scholar has aptly called the archetypal structure of violence, and that were widespread in places like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and elsewhere in South America. And it is when people like Nicolas and Tata begin to ask questions about land reform, when they become, quote, idealists and dreamers and reformers whose mission it is to change the world, that same world witnesses the death-dealing capacities of violence that states are capable of. When soldiers and National Guardsmen and defense budgets are mobilized to protect law and order, to secure the border from foreign invaders, and other such exercises of maintaining, quote, national security. One final comment. Farmer again here is helpful. He notes that one of the lasting effects of structural violence is what he calls, quote, the erasure of history, end quote. In his address, he notes that Tacitus, I think he's a Greek historian, maybe, I don't know, is credited with the aphorism, they created a desert and they called it peace. Erasing history, says Farmer, is perhaps the most common explanatory sleight of hand relied upon by the architects of structural violence. Erasure, or distortion of history, is part of the processes of desocialization necessary for the emergence of hegemonic accounts of what happened and why it happened. And there are certain times, such as now, says Farmer, in which exploring the historical roots of a problem is not very popular. There's not always much support for laying bare the fretwork, Farmer says, of entrenched structures that promise more misery, end quote. This book remembers histories that were intentionally erased by the Salvadoran government and oftentimes disregarded, ignored, and oftentimes, frankly, deemed as exaggerated by my own government of the United States. This book forces us to remember and to lament a very ugly history. But it also compels us to act and remember and account rightly. As Farmer notes, the anthropology, and I would add the storytelling, of structural violence is dour business, end quote. But the enterprise of creating more truthful accountings of history and fighting amnesia is needed now more than ever, I think. Thank you.
All right, so now we have about 18 minutes to play book club together and to have a little bit of a conversation among our panelists. Now, I would just like to begin with a question that has been just occurring to me over and over again as I read this book and as I hear your own engagements with it. The author very, very distinctly situates this book between two precise events, historical events that occur. Yet, here we are with a fictional work that is engaging those events. So, can you help us maybe from your own disciplinary perspectives, maybe as you want to just respond a little bit to what each other have said, what do you think is the benefit of using a novel to think about the in-betweenness of these two particular events, rather than, say, any of the other disciplines that are available here to us tonight, right? A history, an anthropology, a theology of what is happening here. How does the fact that it's a novel make a difference? Does anyone want to start us off here?
Well, I think that one reason why I will embed my answer not just in a novel, but also a novel as a work of art. And I think that a work of art opens a different window of reality for us, and it steers our imagination to see and think of things that we will not normally see. And I think that in this case, there are moments in the book and when he describes, for example, a lot of, with incredible detail, the Salvadorian meal, and especially the humble, some that I think, Jamie, you have experience, I know. Yes. And so at that moment, for me, it was like looking at a window of heaven. It made me think of my grandmother's kitchen, and thinking how in her poverty there was always a pot of beans, coffee, tortillas, because nobody who came to that home would leave hungry if they were hungry. And so, I think this is one way why it is important to tell stories through art, whether it's novel, poetry, music, research. The way Jamie spoke was very poetic, but anthropologists there. So it is important that our imaginations engage and are awakened by art, so that we can properly lament, not just emote.
I just want to add what Carlos says about the importance of storytelling. And I just want to add that in my own understanding, the Bible it's in a sense have, or at least some of the books, this dimension, not only historical. I not say that the Bible is fiction, but I'm saying that it's not only pure history, naked history. It's a kind of history that also allows this artistic, if you will say, or this narratival, this storytelling dimension, which goes beyond and can touch others, sentiments, feelings, and so on. And also, I think this is a kind of, probably, I'm just guessing, an indirect way of talk about a reality that is so cruel, so hard, and not to romanticize the reality, because I don't think the author is doing that, but focus, because she's focused in the main character is a child. I'm so impressed by that, because there is a movie that I also have the privilege to participate with my good friend here, about Voces Inocentes, and maybe some of you have, because it's also about the child during the war, the civil war in El Salvador, and these kind of voices that are innocent, these are the leading voices. This is the leading voice in the story. This is the the important voice that we have to pay attention. So I think that probably also is related to that, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I would say for me, I'm an anthropologist, and our inclination is to do our best as authors to convey what it is that the people that we're listening to and participating in life with, how do our best as anthropologists to best voice, represent, articulate, and make sense of the lived experience of the people that we are experiencing life with. Having said that, though, there's something for me as an anthropologist that artistic works like this capture that I cannot, frankly, capture as an anthropologist. The imaginative dimension that invites the reader into kind of this process of I don't know, it's a creative journey and an imaginative journey that I find that literature engages the person, the reader, in ways that my own discipline cannot. And so I've just found that in my wanting to understand more about the life experience of my Salvadoran friends in rural El Salvador, this book has really helped me begin to see I would just call it kind of the multidimensionality of their experience. That when I think about Salvadoran and the Salvadorans I know and their tremendous resilience, this book captures something about the resilience that I can't really get conceptually as an anthropologist. I can only begin to apprehend through kind of a fictional tale that is embedded in history, but there's something about this fiction that helps me imagine things, I think, in a more humane and maybe even more representative way, I think. I'm still thinking about that as an anthropologist, but it's really challenged me as a scholar of my field to think differently about what it is that I'm writing and talking about as well. So I've really been changed by the book itself. Yes.
Well, literature is my discipline, so of course I think it's amazing. But I think for me, the act of reading a good novel is that ability to sink into a world. And just that immersive experience for me is what makes it so powerful, that it really triggers the imagination on so many different levels, as we are engaging with these characters, with their relationships, with the culture, with, just trying to imagine the landscape and how, and that draws us in because it asks us to be active in that process and really compels us to imagine and therefore put ourselves in that. And so for me, that's what's really valuable about literature.
All of us. So one of the amazing parts about reading Core Book together as part of a Wheaton College experience is coming together as a group of believers encountering this book. And so we are engaging with global Christianity as we read this book. Another set of examples of our brothers and sisters in Christ. And so I wonder if you have any guidance for thinking through the theological aspects of this novel or the religious experience aspects of this novel. Many Wheaton students, most Wheaton students are Protestant. The college is Protestant. And this is a Catholic experience depicted here. How do we think through this well? Do you have thoughts about how to engage this? We were just talking about this in my first year seminar yesterday. And we have some ideas, but I'd like to hear from you as well. Specifically, Miriam Vicious, perhaps?
Well, I noticed that there were several articles on the website about Miriam Vicious. And I would say in this case, I remember, those of us who have had the experience of losing a loved one who was a saint, might have an experience with dreams, with what believed to be, visitations, right? And so, you're not Catholic. Okay, great, And so because God is not God of the dead, He's God of the living, right? And so, there is an element, I think, where we all can relate to it. But at another level, yes, he's Catholic, and the relationship with Mary is different than our relationship. But I think there is also the element, those of us who have dreams. I remember that through the help of a friend, he explained to me that, I just need to be on guard between what are psychological dreams and spiritual dreams or visitation. And in every tradition, including the Catholic tradition, you're called to be, careful. But I think the other element is that, the author is kind of, that's kind of a sort of a glue that brings the story together, right? The operation. There is a device in there.
Just to build on that with the device, I mean, thinking about thematically how it works in the novel, you have this young boy who has lost his mother. And that connection that he has to the Virgin Mary and that comfort and that love that he receives is so powerful as he is going through the process of grieving and coming to terms with that he really, I mean, it takes pretty long for him even to say the words that his mother is dead. And so thematically, I find that really powerful, that he has that spiritual comfort.
Yeah, if I can add to that, related to that, what Christine just said, I do think, well, the first thing, and I think this represented the theologians, that theologians, sometimes we made a mistake to read a novel as a theological treatise, which is a mistake, I think. We have to respect the novel as a novel, as a fiction, and that includes the visions of Mary. It is also the component that Carlos mentioned earlier about the realismo mágico, the magical realism that is so prominent in Latin American literature, as you know. Not only Garcia Marquez, but others writers as well from Latin America. Which is like overlaps reality with other aspect. But the other thing is that, and this is my connection with Christine's comment, is that I do think that the motherhood is so important in the So if we understand, like Christine said, thematically, that is really helpful to understand that the novel begins with a loss, a deep, profound loss of the mother. This bound, but this bound is present through all the novel. And actually, Nicholas, he didn't realize. It's a process to absorb, to digest that loss. The dimension of the loss is so big, so huge. So I think that's the connection in a sense with the presence of Mary. And when you understand Latin American Catholicism, which I will argue that is different with North American Catholicism, the presence of the Virgin Mary has this dimension as the mother. Virgen de Guadalupe, for instance, no? La Madre, the mother. So the importance of the protection of the mother. So, and she's writing for that context, within that context. And we have to respect and understand that in order to fully understand all the apparitions, the visions, and so on about the Virgin.
Yeah, in my course, and we talk about this quite a bit, I've thought about it in two ways. One, as an anthropologist, and two, as a Pentecostal. I'll start with the Pentecostal part. Pentecostals are really okay with visions. Enough said. I'll move on to the anthropological part, and you can. So anthropologically, we kind of wonder and think about how it is that God, as protagonist, is making himself known as a character in the story. We've kind of wondered and thought about why would God speak to and communicate, and how might God we've talked about this kind of thinking out loud, that an intelligible symbol, right, would be Mary in this story, an intelligible symbol to a 9-year-old. And so we've wondered about, among many possible interpretations, and this is what's so wonderful about the talking through literature with the students. We've wondered about, like, in this story, which for many students and when we encounter it does at first strike us as sort of this kind of, quote, God-forsaken story. The history of El Salvador is not a history where God has forsaken people. God is actively at work in the lives of Salvadorans, and I've often wondered, and Salvadoran people in the midst of considerable suffering, but I've often wondered if this kind of element is also a way that the author, and I would like to ask her, is sort of making God known in the story by consistently returning to inspire, lead, direct, encourage, console the one person in the story who seems to be listening, who seems to be paying attention, who has the ears to hear. So we've wondered about that in class. But that's not a theological claim, that's an anthropological description. Just want to be clear about that.
As a Protestant reading about Marian visions myself, I've often looked at Mary as a kind of exemplary figure of discipleship, right? That she is the person who says yes to God, and she is the one who believes in Jesus. And so her exemplarity or whatever in Scripture is really meaningful to me. And I wondered whether, because one of my main questions with the weight of all things is how do we bear the weight of all things? How do we bear this novel? How do we bear it together? And I wondered whether the visions of Mary in the novel offer us, in some ways, a way to bear the weight of all things by following Mary's example. Because what does she do in this novel? She meets Nicolas in the times of extreme difficulty. She comforts him. She rescues him. She is with the child. She is for the child. And in that sense, her actions are profoundly devoted. They are the actions of sort of God with us, right? Like the actions of the mother, the actions of the disciple. And so in that way, I find her exemplary as a figure, just to sort of a little bit try to know what to do with the weight of all things. And in fact, I wonder if we could end a little bit with that question. We are reading this novel on purpose together. And so one of the premises of the core book program is that we bear the weight of all things together, right? And so I wonder if you have ideas about how we should bear the weight of all things together. I'll just mention here that this might be a good time. Carlos has actually brought a greeting to us from a friend of his who witnessed the Simple River massacre.
Survivor, he lives in Dallas, Texas.
Yes, so perhaps that would also be appropriate at this time.
So the one at the forefront is, with a big smile there, is my friend Antonio Herrera, and he is a survivor of the Simple River massacre that ends at the book. And he lives now in Dallas, Texas. He works at the Archbishop Romero Center, and it's a tireless worker for immigrant rights. He was on his way to Washington a couple of years ago to fight for DACA and TPS recipients. And I called him I talked to him a couple of weeks. Let's see, how we're supposed to click in here and play. And he sends a short. I told him that you were reading this book, and he sends his greetings. A greeting to the students from this humble servant. I'm from El Salvador. And I'm happy that they want to hear our history, the Simple River.
Muy bien. Gracias Antonio. Y díganos, ¿usted perdió familiares o queridos, amigos en esta masacre?
That sounds like me. Yeah, I lost friends and family in that cruel river, those times. When we were hurriedly towards Honduras, the National Guard came, and it was raining. And then on the other side was the Honduran army. And they were shooting both sides of the people. So they massacre our people. They were villagers, humble people. Most women, children, and young people. They were mostly farmers. Yeah. So anyway, so he told me more, but that's just a little clip, and he was just thrilled and thankful that you're reading the story.
Would any of you like to comment also on how to bear the weight of all things together?
You know, when you were talking about Mary, I was reminded of the Magnificat of Mary, right? Her song of praise in Luke. I encourage you all to go and read it. It's in Luke 1:46 through 55. But there is something about kind of Mary's theology here that I think is important for us to consider in terms of how we are to bear the weight of all things. And it's a theology that is one that is very mindful of who God is attending to in stories like this. She says, "He has shown might with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the conceit of their heart. He has put down the mighty from their thrones. And he has exalted the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has given help to Israel, his servant, mindful of his mercy, even as he spoke to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his posterity forever." So I think what I'm reminded of when I spend time with my Salvadoran brothers and sisters is the rich historical knowledge that they kind of share with Mary, this kind of imagination that is the history of the imagination that my brothers and sisters in El Salvador share is a history that seems to be much deeper than mine. It remembers how God has been at work through very difficult times for a very long time. It's a faith that holds on and is looking for God in places where God oftentimes is not expected to show up among the lowly, and brings about surprising change in the lives of those people that is good news for everyone. And so there's something about it for me in terms of who I'm listening to as I bear the weight of all things, who I'm coming alongside and learning how to bear the weight of all things. I've learned so much more from my Salvadoran friends who have borne weights that I have never borne before, that enable me to bear the burdens and weights in my own life, but also give me the opportunity to share in bearing the burdens with them. But certainly in my experience, I've certainly received much more about how to bear burdens from my Salvadoran friends than I have given to them. So I think for those of us that find ourselves on lamenting from the other side, not in the middle of the war, but perhaps lamenting the effects or causes of war, I think it's an important thing for us to do is to come alongside those who are bearing those weights and to see how we might bear them together. Who we befriend, who we listen to matters.
Well, in my case, and while I was listening to James, I was thinking about this connection between the character of the story, not only Mary, but Nicholas. And think about the allusion and the mention that Jamie made about the Magnificat. So I started thinking what were Mary and Joseph's social conditions, socioeconomic conditions, and Jesus as well. So it made me to think that with who Jesus identifies, and with who I'm identifying with as a Christian. And for me, this story is so powerful because it represents the voices of the one that regularly had been unheard. So, and there is an anecdote that I read about the author, because the author was not Salvadorian per se, even though I believe that his father is from the United States and his mother from Puerto Rico. but she grew up in El Salvador. And she told an anecdote that when she came back to the high school here in the United States, she doesn't fit because she had the experience from El Salvador. And she told also that she learned to be a writer unconsciously, even though she didn't realize, by listening to the stories of her nanas, the maids, which were campesinas. And she had to write the letters because they cannot write, they cannot read. So Sandra Benitez has to read the letters, write the letters, and listen to the stories. And that struck me profoundly because it made me to think that we should listen to the stories of the other. Like the Conacaste tree, yeah. Yeah, so
it struck me as everyone was speaking, I remembered this passage from the novel. Concealed under the ledge, outraged and incredulous, they heard shooting from the right, from the left, and from above. They watched the bullets find their marks. They watched the people sink. They watched the river bury them. Under the ledge, the three witnessed what their memories would contain forever. River, stone, dust, bone. These were the things they would carry, the things they would not forget. I read that last sentence, the things they would not forget, and I really see that as a challenge to us. That they don't have to keep that in their own memories. They can share those stories. We can listen to those stories. And we can participate in that by opening ourselves up to their stories, by learning from their stories, that there's something powerful in that I think really resonates for me after reading this book.
Thank you all so much for being here. I just pray that as you leave here, that you will carry the book with you, that you won't close it for good, but that you will bear witness to what you have seen and heard here. Thanks.